I'm a proud member of the Community Relations Council of the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater. We're glad you joined us for today's discussion titled Israel and the Territories, Calculating the Risk-Reward Ratio. The possibility that Israel may extend sovereignty, or as many prefer to say, annex part of the West Bank, has provoked a rather intense controversy. So we brought together two experts to discuss the issue. It's a timely conversation as the Israeli government, headed by President Benjamin Netanyahu, could begin to make changes in the coming days. I will introduce our two speakers, and we invite you to submit questions in the QA tab at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Jonathan Schanzer is a Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracy. His books, State of Failure, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and the Unmaking of the Palestinian State, and Hamas vs. Fatah, The Struggle for Palestine, have made unique contributions to the field of Middle East studies. You may recognize Jonathan from his frequent appearances on CNBC, Fox News, CBS, and more, or from his visit to Tidewater in February 2019, where he spoke as part of the CRC and Community Partners Israel Today series with Art Sandler and Representative Elaine Luria. Ghaith Al-Omari is a senior fellow in the Washington Institute's Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israeli Strategic Relationship and the former executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine. He served as advisor to the negotiating team during the 1999-2001 permanent status talks and held various other positions with the Palestinian Authority. Ghaith and Jonathan, welcome. We are thrilled to have you both with us today. Jonathan and Ghaith have been on the road together for years, from Washington to Tidewater. So now I'll turn the program over to the two of you and to give your opening remarks.
All right, thank you, Herm. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, thank you first for the kind introduction, and thank you for the Federation, particularly to Robin, who's been great in organizing this. I'm going to try to stick in my 5 minutes to the topic, the risk-reward ratio. But before I do that, I just want to put it out there. I personally am an opponent of annexation. We can go into why this is the case, but I will try to be more analytical in this presentation. And here I see that the conversation about the cost-benefit analysis tends to gravitate towards extremes, which are generally not accurate. You have people who are against annexation telling you the sky is going to fall. You have people who are for annexation will tell you that, oh, it's going to be cost-free. And the reality is somewhere in between. The sky will certainly not fall. I don't see violence in the Palestinian Authority. The PA, for its own reasons, Abbas, the Palestinian president, for his own reasons, has no interest in a new intifada and widespread violence. While the PA has cut security coordination with Israel, it continues to fulfill many of the security functions that it fulfilled before. Even today, we saw a couple of incidents when it did that. Hamas itself has no interest in shattering the kind of balance of stability that the tacit understanding that it will reach with Israel. So I don't see violence as an immediate result. Jordan and Egypt have very strong security, and in the case of Jordan, also economic benefits from the treaty with Israel, and neither of them will abrogate the treaty. And the Gulf will unlikely seek to preserve the security contact, the under-the-table security contact that it has with Israel. That said, this is not going to be cost-free. The PA will have to react, and its reaction, probably through limited demonstrations, increases the volatility on the ground in the West Bank and creates a dangerous situation. I know the IDF and the Shin Bet are very worried about these kinds of unintended consequences. Hamas in Gaza will feel compelled to react. Obviously, it will try to increase terror in the West Bank. It helps it, but it will also feel compelled to react in Gaza. And we might see a return to the kind of very tense, controlled escalation that we saw years ago demonstrations on the fence, rockets being shot at communities near Gaza. So this raises the possibility of things going wrong. For Jordan, they will have to react. And here I have to point out that the Jordanian reaction will not only be motivated by a desire to, if you wish, manage or vent public discontent. Jordan feels that it has very, very deep national security interest at stake with this and will have to react. And its reaction will be diplomatic. It will definitely withdraw ambassadors. It will lead the international diplomatic effort to isolate Israel. It will be joined definitely by Egypt. Saudi Arabia will not be left behind and will join this. So we will see certainly a strong diplomatic and maybe bilateral reaction by some of these Arab states. The Gulf states, Saudi and UAE in particular, while they will keep their security relations with Israel, I believe that they will slow down or even freeze some of these civilian overtures that we saw over the last few years. I think it's worth reading the op-ed that the Emirati ambassador to the US published in Yediot Ahronot. I think it tells you very well how the Emiratis feel about it. Europe will react. And by the way, even some of the European countries that are traditionally seen as friendly to Israel will have to react, not necessarily because of the Israeli or Palestinian angle, but because they're afraid that annexation will create a precedent for Russia to step in. So there will be an international reaction. Finally, I think, to my mind, the most worrying component of this is not the rational, calculated reaction that I mentioned. It is some of the unintended consequences of this action. Yes, the PA and Jordan have no interest in escalation, yet if we start seeing a strong public reaction in these two countries, they might be forced to act in ways that they don't want to act. In particular, in Jordan, there is concern that the Muslim Brotherhood is gaining traction because of the atmosphere created by annexation. And I see the annexation as threatening the two-state solution, and with that threatening the very basic foundation of why the Palestinian Authority was created. Yes, the PA does not want to dissolve itself, but I can see a dynamic that will be created that might make the PA almost redundant and will create a slow collapse. Certainly Hamas, for the last month at least, has been pushing in that direction in terms of its political messaging. No matter what you think of the PA, and I personally am a big critic of the PA, I think a collapse of the PA would create a major political and security vacuum in the West Bank that will not be to the interest, certainly of the Palestinians, but of Israel and of Jordan as well. So as we look at this, ultimately, Israel will do what Israel will do. It will have its own calculations, but I think it will be a mistake to approach this debate without looking in a very clear-eyed ways of what are the costs associated with this move. With this, I will stop and looking forward to the conversation.
Okay. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Herm, and want to echo Ghaith. I want to thank Robin, who I had the pleasure of working with last year. Had a terrific visit to the Tidewater community, so it's great to be with you all again, even virtually. And Ghaith, always great to work with you. This is our first virtual event together. We've done many where we've sat side by side, but never in this way, I think. So it's the first time for everything. We like to call our debates a dog and pony show. I'll let you guys decide who the dog and the pony is at the end of this. I'll say in general, Ghaith and I often agree on a lot, and I will say that we're going to agree a lot here as well. But what I want to do is I want to introduce a few reasons why Israel might do this and why it would be justified in doing so based on conversations that I've had with Israelis, and then get to my own assessment after that, which I think really tracks really very much with that of Ghaith. Look, from Israel's perspective, number one, the Israelis are deeply concerned about what Abba Eban famously termed Auschwitz borders. That the thin waistline of Israel, that area between the West Bank and the Mediterranean Sea, at its thinnest point is 13 miles. Israel has felt very vulnerable as a result of those borders. which of course were, a consequence of pre-1948 discussions, and they were always going to be thin in certain areas. But of course, Israel did not expect this long war that has played out with the Arab world. It's waxed and waned over the years, but those Auschwitz borders, as they've been called, are still of major concern to Israeli leaders, and they would like to be able to change those legally if possible, but without the legal recourse, maybe through other means. Also, speaking of legally, there is the question that Israeli leaders continue to point to, which is the international law component of all of this, that Israel did conquer the West Bank in 1967 in what is broadly termed to be a legal war, a defensive war, and one that was necessary. And so it has, it doesn't mean that it has the right to annex, but how Israel came into custody of this territory, I think, is not really, I think people are still disputing it, but from a legal perspective, it was seen as a legal war. And of course, since that time, since the 1967 war, we have seen a consistent refusal on the part of the Arab states to negotiate over a final status or even the return of those territories to a previous power. Now, the previous power is something else that Israel continues to point to, which is that this territory was first Ottoman, then British Mandatory Palestine, then was actually under the occupation of Jordan, and now it's under the control of the Israelis. At no point was it ever Palestinian per se in a legal sense, and this is something that the Israelis continue to point to. The Israelis also talk about Palestinian intransigence and how the Palestinians have never really had to pay a real price for their refusal to engage seriously in negotiations. We've seen rejection after rejection by the Palestinians during bilateral talks led by the United States. There's, of course, the Arab intransigence as well, although we do see a softening of that in recent years as the Arab states have warmed up to Israel as a result of their joint concerns over the Iran nuclear program. And then finally, from the Israeli perspective right now, they're looking really at this very unique window of the Trump administration, where the Trump administration is offering the opportunity to annex, although we could maybe discuss a little bit about how that has shifted over the last couple of weeks or months. But the Israelis see this as an historic opportunity to address all the issues that I've just mentioned, and with that window potentially closing in November, right? So, or January, I suppose. And so the Israelis feel like maybe this is the time to do it. If there ever will be one, it will be now, or they may not get it again. Now, I've laid out the reasons why Israel might do this in anticipation of Ghaith laying out the reasons why Israel shouldn't. That said, I'm not a proponent of annexation. I will continue to support Israel and its right to exist, whether it does this or not. It is, at the end of the day, a sovereign decision to be undertaken by the Israeli government, and I've explained the reasons why they might. But I do think that there are real risks. I think that there is a risk of a third intifada. I think there is the risk of let's just say, relinquishing gains that Israel has made with some of the Gulf Arab states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis. I mean, this is progress that I never in my life ever thought would happen. And the Israelis are on the cusp of something really remarkable here with the rest of the Arab world. I mean, dare I say, regional peace is within reach. And the Israelis could scuttle all of that by making this unilateral move. There is the concern that we have about Jordan. The Jordanian king has gone, to use a poker term, he has gone all in opposing annexation. And if the Israelis went ahead and did this anyway, you could imagine that the king's position in the kingdom might be severely damaged, and I have real concerns about that. I've got concerns about the Democratic Party and how the Democrats view Israel's potential annexation move and how it could alienate Israel in a future administration. specifically a Biden administration. And of course, the bipartisan support for Israel, as I think the Jewish Federation knows well, has been one of Israel's great strengths over the years. It's one of the reasons why Israel has been as strong as it has been diplomatically, militarily, and otherwise. And then finally, you know, there's been a lot of talk about Democrats potentially turning on Israel. I will say this, that Ghaith mentioned Europeans taking action against Israel. I don't see unanimous EU action against Israel, but certainly individual states could take action against Israel for annexation. And what that would do is put Israel at a disadvantage in terms of trade. They would need to find other trade partners very quickly. The most obvious country that could fill that gap quickly would be China, which would put Israel on a collision course with Republicans. And that is, of course, something that we don't want to see. So for all of these reasons, I think that there are real risks. The way that I have tried to describe this more broadly is that it feels like elective surgery, that in Israel's history, when it has had to go to war or undertake military operations, it has done so under threat of annihilation or under major strategic threat that Israel could be damaged significantly. I've never really seen Israel take elective surgery in this way. And of course, every time you get on that operating table, there are risks, whether Israel wants to admit it or not. To just conclude very quickly, I think it's interesting that in Israel, there's not really a vociferous debate among Israelis about this. People are tired. They're actually even a little bit bored about this debate. This is largely an American debate or a diaspora debate. And so it's interesting to me that in Israel, there's just not a lot of interest in this. But what I will say is that there is still, I think, an inclination on the part of Israelis, and I'm hearing this from Palestinians, from Israelis alike, and from some American folks in the Beltway, that Israel may not do the full 30%, that they could elect to pursue a more pragmatic approach where the major settlement blocks, as delineated in the Bush-Sharon letters of 2004, could be what's actually undertaken here. It would address some of the demographic issues that have come up over the years, because out of the 450,000 settlers, roughly 200 or 250,000 live in these major settlement blocks. And you could imagine that Israel might be able to negotiate kind of a slicing of the salami, let's say, in a way that might placate some of the Arab states and Jordan, and perhaps even through an arrangement with the PA, kind of settle this for now, with future discussions tabled for a later time. One last thing that I'll say in conclusion here is, Ghaith talked about his criticism of the Palestinian Authority, and I would say that very few people are better placed to make those criticisms than Ghaith, who worked very closely with Mahmoud Abbas and saw his negotiating style up front. Now, Ghaith and I will disagree a little bit here and there on the history of Palestinian engagement and negotiations, but I will say is that the Palestinians have not yet had to pay a real price for intransigence at the negotiating table, in my view. I do think that there should be a price to pay for this. The Palestinians, continue to reject deals that are put on the table. They continue to reject even the notion of coming to the table right now, and I understand they're not happy with Donald Trump. I understand a lot of people are not happy with Donald Trump, but it is incumbent upon the Palestinians to come to the table. If they don't, I think Israel will have the right to move forward. I just don't think they need to do it right now. I'll end there.
Well, great. Those were great comments. And, I've heard you both talk very succinctly about the effects in different nations, especially, the growing relationships that Israel has with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But as you talk about that, really isn't the focus and concern of all those nations Iran? And will that focus, that really intense, very, real danger that Iran poses, first to Israel, and then, of course, to the rest of the world, United States included, is that enough to maintain good relationships, even if Israel does this?
Sure. Let me take a
yeah.
look. Absolutely. For the Gulf states, Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, Iran is an immediate and an existential threat. and rightly so. I mean, we saw the Iranian fingerprints on the terrorist attacks on the biggest oil facility in the world, the Ghaith recently, and more recently, they're attacking Saudi civilian and military targets in Saudi Arabia. So for sure, Iran is the number one concern for these countries. And that's why I said these countries will maintain their security relations with Israel. And by the way, these relations have existed even before it became fashionable to talk about them. I mean, at least 2 decades ago, I'm aware of meetings on the intelligence level between the two. And these will continue in the same way that Jordan and Egypt's military and security relations with Israel will continue. The problem and the difference is not here. It is on the kind of more civilian aspect of the relationship. I am personally a proponent of the idea of normalizing Israel in the region. I do believe that the more Israel feels secure in the region and welcomed in the region, not only in a military sense, but also in a civilian, cultural sense, the more Israel is likely to feel comfortable moving towards reaching a deal. And I very much appreciate what the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and to a lesser extent the Saudis have done in reaching out publicly in these ways to Israel. This is what I think it becomes impossible to maintain. These are the relations that become impossible to maintain for these countries. Already, these countries are paying a big political price. And every time there's an outreach step from the Emirates or the Saudis, you have the Iranian media, the Qatari media slamming them for being sellouts, etc., etc. In the face of an annexation, these kinds of important civilian relations will, in my view, become almost impossible. And that would be a loss to everyone. Certainly to the Israelis, but the Israelis can speak about it, but also to the Arab world. And this is what I see, a loss that is simply not justified from my point of view by the kind of gain that would come from this.
Okay. Jonathan, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, what I would say is that what we've seen over the last couple of years, as a direct consequence of first the interim nuclear deal of 2013, and then the final nuclear deal of 2015, is the Arab states and Israel have lost some confidence in the United States. There was a real concern that the Obama administration had lost sight of the alliances that they had in the region and that they were devaluing them, that this agreement was made without the consent of any of these countries that we're talking about. I mean, Israel, but also Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, Egypt, Jordan, all these countries were left out. They were on the sidelines. And so, I always talk about this sort of joke that I hear from the region that, Barack Obama got his Nobel Prize in 2009 for basically overturning the Bush doctrine, but he should have got it in 2015 when he signed the nuclear deal, not because he prevented Iran from going nuclear. We see, of course, that they're still making progress today in that space. But he's so thoroughly scared both sides, the Arabs and Israelis, that they began to speak very clearly about the need to work together, and that perhaps he should have gotten a Nobel Prize then, not in 2009. And so this has been the cornerstone of the relationship ever since. And it's not going anywhere anytime soon. And with the Arab states, I think they've begun to realize that while they support the Palestinian cause, while they would like to see Palestinian nationalism realized, that it is no longer a core national interest for them. And that's a big difference, right? To say this is important to us, but there are other things that are more important to us. That's what we're seeing out of these Arab states, and I think we're going to see that continue. What I would like to see, though, is a formalization of that process. I would like to see everyone sign onto the dotted line. I think Ghaith is absolutely right that if that is able to happen, then you will see an Israel that is more comfortable in taking risks for peace. You'll see an Israel that is engaging more directly with these Arab states, that will be putting more pressure directly and openly on the Palestinians in order to concede things at the table and to be more flexible. This is, I think, the kind of the way forward. This is what people are calling the outside-in approach to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I don't believe that the two-state paradigm as we know it right now is particularly viable, but I do believe that this regional construct is one that can work in the long term. And that's why, among all the reasons that I described, it's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit iffy on this whole annexation process.
Great. And you both mentioned also about the Palestinian Authority, not your favorite in this whole negotiations and historically, I suspect. So, they were offered, obviously Trump offered in this peace settlement and the annexation piece, a lot of money. That didn't go over. Obviously, they're not fans of the annexation. That's pretty obvious. So what is it that in the Palestinian Authority that needs to be done to actually get to where you were just talking, Jonathan, about, hey, some regional concurrence? Can they get there with the present structure? Can they get there with where they are today and the leadership?
I guess I'll take this one first. Ghaith and I would say largely agree on this. So I might steal some of his thunder, so apologies in advance, Ghaith. The Palestinian Authority right now is deeply dysfunctional, and actually, in my view, the key is actually to make it more viable again. So one of the problems that we have is Mahmoud Abbas has been in power since 2005. It means he's 15 years into a 4-year term. He's not stepping out of the way. I think the only way he leaves the Muqata compound in Ramallah is feet first on a gurney. He refuses to name a vice president. He refuses to talk about alternative power structures. He refuses to allow for an open political debate, even about the potential need to negotiate with Israel during a Trump administration. I mean, there are no alternative voices, right? There are no attempts to create infrastructure on the ground, institutions to engage in reform. These things are highly, highly problematic. And for those of us that have dared to speak out about corruption within the Palestinian Authority, political corruption, economic corruption, I personally was sued, this was, I guess, 7 years ago now, for $20 million in an American court for speaking out about corruption in the Abbas family. I'm still here in my home, so I didn't have to sell it, and I prevailed. But you get a sense of the price that you can pay, and that's just me, right? This is an American. Now think about if you are a Palestinian with few rights in the West Bank, what that's like. And so my sense is that in order for us to get to that next phase, to make the Palestinian Authority more viable, we need new leadership. We need it. We need it desperately. And there are people, I'll let Ghaith talk about Salam Fayyad, who I know he's close with. There have been people that have come out of the PA that have represented some hope in this regard. We've watched them fail. We've watched them been railroaded out of politics by Mahmoud Abbas, who has really, I think, become the primary roadblock. Not the only roadblock. I think there's education problems. There's, the glorification of violence and other things that are cultural that need to be undone. But I think, again, it all starts with the leadership, and the leadership has failed.
I mean, let me maybe just take it on one of the tangents that John went on, which is the issue of governance. Look, I mean, I'm a big fan of the George W. Bush approach to this, and for a reason. I mean, Bush said, first you need to have a legitimate, reformed, non-corrupt authority, then you can move on to negotiation, and that makes sense. I mean, if you look at negotiations, we are talking about conceding on both sides of issues of deep significance to both nations. On the Palestinian side, to reach a peace deal, you have to give up on the right of return, you have to have a demilitarized Palestinian state, etc. To make these kinds of concessions, you need to have legitimate leadership. When the Palestinian public, when 80% of the Palestinians polled consistently in different polls tell you that the Palestinian Authority is corrupt, that they are being led by thieves, how could you expect the Palestinians to give their leaders the mandate to go and make these kind of deep concessions? The institutions are weak, and I fully understand the Israeli and Jordanian concern. If you create a Palestinian state with weak institutions, and it will become a failed state. Look, one of my personal kind of opposition, not only to the Trump peace plan, but also to the Obama approach, is the fact that I don't think right now, given the reality in the Palestinian Authority, as well as, by the way, the political reality in Israel, that a peace deal is possible. But I think there is a lot that can be done before reaching a peace deal that we should do, whether it is focusing on reform in the Palestinian Authority, including the issue of who will come after Abbas, building institutions. And this is where you actually will see some receptivity among many significant Palestinians. John mentioned former Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, who basically said, first you build the state, then you declare the state. You see reform working actually well when there is an international desire to have reform. Under George W. Bush, there was a push to reform the Palestinian security sector. Today, as a result of this, and it's an effort that continues to be led by a 3-star American general, very impressive individuals who filled that role, that produced unprecedented and really useful security cooperation. So from my perspective right now, let's not talk about these kind of pie in the sky, big ideas, and let's focus on small, achievable, concrete things that will reverse the kind of negative trends. And when the time is right, we can start talking about peace and negotiations and whatnot.
Wow, very good. So we kind of touched on security, a little bit of politics. Let's kind of shift a little to economics. And certainly, you know, when we talk about Israel as a sort of an economic juggernaut right now in terms of gas and oil and, you know, relationships with Jordan, that's got to put a little bit of hesitation on Jordan. I mean, if they go ahead, if Israel annexes and Jordan pulls out, there's going to be some repercussions. But I think also, so I'd like to touch on that particular piece, but also let's talk about, you know, the economics and at least the situation among Americans that look at boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and sort of that movement. You know, and do we think that there would be a huge resurgence of that? And would that actually damage Israel's economic kind of resurgence and where they are in the world? Ghaith, you want to take that first?
Sure. I mean, look, the economy, first of all, I mean, as a general statement, economic considerations are very important, but they are not the core considerations. And I think this is something that often we misunderstand, that ultimately this is a political and an identity and a national kind of struggle that has to be resolved on these bases. But the economy matters. Economy matters a lot. And a lot of the kind of relations that we have between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors are economically driven as much as security and political. And this is what I mentioned earlier, that at least for Jordan, the issue of, you know, how will they respond? They will try to preserve 3 things: security cooperation with Israel, the water relations, because Jordan is water scarce and Israel is a leader in water technology, desalination, and other kinds of technology, and energy because of the Israeli gas. Yet these things ultimately will come under pressure from the Jordanian opposition. I know the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, the Jordanian parliament, are making the gas deal as their kind of, you know, primary talking points these days. So the Jordanians will have to balance all of these. In terms of the impact on Israel of the BDS and whatnot, and by the way, personally, I'm against BDS for a number of reasons. I don't see Israel in the short term hurting from BDS per se. BDS is still, I think, a fringe marginal group. But I think what BDS is doing is kind of giving a platform to political voices that I'm worried about. I am worried about what I hear from quarters in the Democratic Party, the so-called progressive quarters, that want to use annexation, frankly, to my mind, not to the benefit of Palestinians, but rather to as a way of clobbering Israel. If there is annexation, these voices will be strengthened. I look at the Europeans, and I think that their opposition to annexation and the fact that they will take, at least as John said, on a bilateral, not a collective level, they will take action. This is not a BDS move. This is a move that is driven by Europe's own view of what international law is and the way it conducts its relations. These things will impact Israel. I think Israel, I mean, I can't speak for Israel, but I think Israel is a robust enough economy that can deal with it, but it's not going to come without cost. And a point that John mentioned, driving Israel towards China will impact not only Israel democratic relations, but Israel-US relations, because China is trying to use this economic wedge as a way of creating an intelligence and a security footprint in Israel and in the region.
Jonathan, any thoughts?
Sure. I mean, look, again, I would agree with a lot of what Ghaith just said. On the Jordan issue, I think Ghaith's right that this is not, at the end of the day, an economic issue for really, I think, anyone involved. On the Palestinian side, here they are, they're being offered untold billions, although it is questionable right now whether the world could afford this in the wake of COVID. And of course, the plan came out before the pandemic, before the huge amount of outlays that were required in order to kind of stem the bleeding here in the United States and abroad. So I do wonder whether that's even feasible now. That's a question that I suppose we'd have to ask Jared Kushner and company. But in the meantime, I would say that the Palestinians have never been seduced by cash. I mean, there was, I guess, a time in the 1990s when Arafat was sort of rolling in paper bags full of dollars. But at the end of the day, he still didn't make, in my view, the right choice when offered peace at Camp David in 2000. He still chose a second intifada as opposed to even continued negotiation, let alone the deal that was put on the table. So it doesn't resonate with the Palestinians. With the Jordanians, I would argue that the economic benefits, they're going to get the economic benefits from the United States regardless. So, but where the rubber meets the road for Jordan and Israel is actually security cooperation, intelligence cooperation. In many ways, Israel keeps Jordan solvent and whole from a security perspective, and that's the concern that I have there, that if Jordan decides to spurn Israel, there could be a real price to pay in terms of stability and security inside the kingdom. As far as BDS is concerned, I've done a lot of work on BDS. I've uncovered a lot of connections between BDS groups and Hamas and other extremist groups. I will say that this is not a social justice movement, that this is very much an extension of the Arab boycott, which existed pre-1948, which was a very clear attempt to strangle or smother Israel economically, to basically suffocate it before the state was created and after the state was created. When the Arab boycott sputtered and ultimately failed, in my view, the BDS movement took up that mantle, and they are now the vanguards. What is interesting to me right now is that BDS is moribund. Maybe not quite dead, but it is not doing well. The reason for that is that BDS is not able to mobilize on campus right now because campus doesn't exist. People don't want to be boycotting Israeli products because, look, these are the products that could ultimately help us make massive advances in AI or in other weapons of the future. But in the meantime, the Israelis might be the ones that come up with the next vaccine or viral therapy to help deal with COVID-19. So the idea that somehow people want to start to jettison Israel at a time where we may need Israeli technology, and whereas Israel actually, even the recent spike notwithstanding, has come out of the COVID crisis and is functioning relatively well and is able to get back to something resembling business as usual, it's a mistake for people to get involved in this. Now, if Israel does annex, then you could see a resurgence of BDS. You're going to give that movement some oxygen. You're going to give reason for people to try to protest and to get angry out on the streets. You're already seeing a sort of a confluence, a weird confluence of Black Lives Matter and BDS. Sort of some of these social justice movements that have manifested over the last several months here in the United States. They have embraced BDS, although I have to say it's been a minority perspective up until now. We don't need to be giving these people additional reasons to support boycotts of Israel. But I think the biggest risk that I see right now is angering the Democrats in particular, and putting aid to Israel up on the chopping block in some shape or form. It's just not something that Israel needs right now. By the way, I would note that it might be the right move for Israel to start to draw down on American aid, but not under pressure because of a move that it made that had political reverberations across the Middle East and angered half of the political spectrum here in the United States.
Yeah. So there's a question from one of our listeners that is kind of a follow through to that discussion. And Simon asks, to what extent is Israel listening to this debate in America? Can grassroots efforts speaking out about Israel's annexation through our synagogues, charities, federation, etc., affect Israel policy directly, or is it about getting American lawmakers to speak out?
You know, I guess I'll start. I'll just say this. I think Israel has heard American lawmakers loud and clear. I think they're seeing a yellow light even from the Trump administration right now. So whereas in the early goings, it looked like the Trump administration was just kind of giving them a full green light to do this, I think you're now even seeing the Trump administration pump the brakes a little bit, wondering about whether this is the right time with the world being what it is. Do we really need added headaches and the potential for more conflict or more political challenges? So you're even seeing it from the Trump administration. I think that it's interesting though, because the debate here in the United States, the Jewish diaspora, I think we're largely speaking to ourselves here. I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing. If you look at the Israeli press, not in English, but in Hebrew, there are so few pieces that address all of the hand-wringing that we see here in the United States. The Hebrew press is just so much more concerned about the pandemic, about Iran, about Hezbollah, about existential threats. They're not really talking about this right now. Of course, the Israeli left, like the sort of groups like B'Tselem and Peace Now and others, they are very much engaged on this issue, and they're trying to mobilize the Israeli public. But the Israeli public, I got to tell you, they're bored. They're yawning. They're just kind of wondering. They like to pick up the remote and change the channel on this. You know, they just actually, in many ways, they don't see this as being a major change from what is already the reality, which is that Israel controls this territory and that it's not likely to give it up anytime soon. So to me, that's really interesting. I do think, though, that there is a real risk. As an American Jew, I have to say I'm concerned that Jews in the United States may begin to look at Israel differently after annexation. That, you know, Israel has, even as it's grown stronger, even as its military has been able to demonstrate on the battlefield its prowess, Israel is still largely seen by the diaspora as being David against a bigger Arab Goliath, right? And for Israel to become, or at least to be seen in some way or form as the aggressor, or as someone that is taking liberties beyond defense, I think could backfire on Israel. And quite frankly, it's one of the arguments that I've made to Israelis is like, you know, this is not the time to be doing this. I'm not sure there's ever a time to be doing it, but do you really want to alienate your most important base of support?
Look, I mean, first, certainly, I'm not going to touch the Israel-Jewish diaspora debate. There's enough headaches in the Palestinian diaspora debate. I am not sure that, by the way, even what we're hearing on the Hill in Congress is resonating much in Israel, in the sense that I think, and this is one thing that I certainly fault Bibi in managing the relationship, his approach has also contributed to this kind of lack of bipartisanship. And almost every Democratic member of Congress that I speak to always references the time that when Bibi came and spoke to Congress behind the back of Obama. What really matters is what's happening in the administration. And here, really, you have three trends that are yet unresolved. As we speak, the administration is meeting to consider how to approach it. You have one trend represented by Ambassador Friedman, who basically is all for annexation and sees this in the same way that I think Bibi sees it, as an opportunity, once in a lifetime opportunity. But there are two other trends. One is represented maybe by Kushner himself, who looks at the American peace plan, at the Trump peace plan as a whole, as a holistic approach. He doesn't look at it as an annexation plan, but as a plan that includes annexation, but other things. And here, this trend in the administration wants Israel, if it wants to annex, to give something back to the Palestinians, whether to recognize the idea of a two-state solution, as represented in the Trump plan, an economic package, things of this sort. And Israel, for its own reason, is unwilling to do this at the moment. And there's a third, maybe less significant, but not marginal trend, which is, the establishment, the professionals, people like Pompeo and people like in the defense and intelligence community, who are always looking at it from the point of view of not only how this impacts U.S.-Israel relations, but how this impacts wider U.S. interests in the region. And many of them who are exposed to Arab voices and European voices see this as a potentially unnecessary headache.
Herm, just to add one more thing to what Ghaith just said, certainly within the U.S. defense and intelligence establishment, they're sort of seeing, they're sounding the alarm, and the Israelis are hearing it. But something that's also interesting here is that the Israeli defense and intelligence establishment is also a little bit nervous about what's going on here. The Israeli military was not consulted in the initial discussions of what the new borders would look like, and are only now getting up to speed on that. We have senior officials from the Shin Bet have quietly, and in some cases not so quietly, voiced their concern about what the security implications would be of annexation. And, this is something that can't be discounted. And even within the Israeli political establishment, I mean, we've seen people like Benny Gantz kind of lend his support to some element of annexation, but some of his senior advisors, some of the people that are closest to him, have all voiced some of their own concerns as well. It's one of the reasons, again, why I think we may ultimately see a partial annexation that kind of goes back to the kind of the Bush-Sharon letters of 2004, what is largely seen as kind of more of the norm in all of this, as opposed to some of the more far-flung settlements in the Jordan Valley, which I think are far more controversial. There are areas that defense officials have long been thinking about as being officially part of Israel, and then there are those that are not, and that's where you're seeing the Israeli officials coupled with the U.S. officials and all the other things that we've talked about, where people have been voicing their discomfort or concerns.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question from the audience. This is a question from Mark, and he asks, how can the panelists claim that the Palestinians have not paid a price for being unwilling to accept the proposed terms when the settlements themselves have exacted a massive price by destroying the possibility of territorial continuity in any future Palestinian state? Maybe we'll start with Ghaith for that one.
Sure, and here, by the way, I mean, this is one of the few points I disagree with John. I mean, ultimately, the price that the Palestinians had to pay is a continuation of the occupation. The fact that they did not ultimately get their own state. I mean, look, and I'll say this because it's all in the record. I have always been a proponent within the Palestinian system, and when I left it, of the Palestinians actually becoming more forthcoming in reaching a deal, not as a service to Israel, but ultimately, I believe that the idea of establishing a Palestinian state is something that is in the interest of the Palestinians. It's not a favor they're doing to Israel or to anyone else. And I've always felt that the biggest loser, not as a point of kind of conceptual or ethical, but from a practical point of view, the Palestinians are the losers in this. But what I would say is the following, that in diplomatic terms, the PA has never really had faced a position where saying no will come with a political price. And this, I have to say, Abbas and Arafat, but Abbas even more than Arafat, are very skilled in terms of, when they say no. And by the way, when they say no, it's not only their fault. I was in Camp David, and I can say that what was offered in Camp David was not something I would have accepted. Yet there was a sense that not presenting alternative proposals, not being more forthcoming, comes without a cost. And I think this is where I would like to see more, how shall I say it, friendly pressure from the Arab countries, from the Europeans on the Palestinians, saying, we will support you. We support you fundamentally in your right to have your own state, but ultimately we want to see a more proactive view from you. From my perspective today, what the PA should do is present its own realistic peace plan, I think this will shift the whole debate. But today, there is no price for not doing so in a diplomatic way. And sadly, yes, the price continues to be paid by the Palestinian people, but not by the Palestinian Authority.
Interesting. Good.
Yeah, look, what I would say further to that is that the Palestinian strategy from the very beginning has been to reject Israel's existence, to reject diplomatic overtures, and to perpetuate the conflict, and with the idea that over time, the demographics, the politics, the military balance might shift. And this was the thinking early on in pre-48, post-48, post-67, and I think in large part it still exists today. The demand for right of return, the rejection of what I think have been very generous and pragmatic peace deals, and that I think that the existence of Israeli settlements is a price that Palestinians have had to pay. It's also the price of continued rejectionism. It's the price of the Arabs rejecting it. I mean, I think back to the 1967 Arab League declaration of those three no's, right? No recognition, no peace, no negotiation with Israel. This was the official position of the Arab world and of the Palestinians. And so not having anyone to talk with, not having any other alternatives, you began to see the Israelis taking unilateral measures, and they continue to this day. And so this has been, I think, the sad story of the Palestinians over time, this continued rejectionism. And I think to Ghaith's point, as they've rejected deal after deal, as they've failed to come back with counteroffers, which I think is the most important thing. It's one thing to have a U.S. deal on the table that you don't like. It's another thing to just say, well, we don't like it, and therefore we're not talking to you, when what we're trying to do is to reach an end of conflict. The Palestinians have been intransigent from the get-go. The problem that I've had is that the Palestinians have always been able to pick up where they left off in negotiations. In other words, they take the best deal that they had from 5, 8, 10 years ago, and they try to go back to that. What's interesting now is that the Trump administration has eviscerated that strategy for the Palestinians. There is now something on the table, whether or not there is annexation, whether or not anything comes of the Trump deal, the Palestinians are always going to go back to the last deal, which I suppose was Olmert, or maybe during the Obama years, right, where I don't know, let's say 95 or so % of the West Bank is on the table. And then the Israelis are going to come back and say, no, we are now, we're starting from the position of, we're taking 30% of the West Bank as stipulated in the Trump plan. So that leaves you with 70%, not 95%. And then that's where I think the give and take is going to come. I think that's the price that the Palestinians pay right now at minimum. At maximum, for not engaging, you could see annexation unilaterally. But of course, that could blow back on Israel as well.
Wow, thank you. And so
looks
both
like I have a response. I saw him go like this more than once.
Go ahead, Ghaith. Yes.
Because finally, there's something that John and I fundamentally disagree on. And I think here, look, I mean, first of all, I think it is important to point out that some of the positions that John mentioned from the 1960s have changed. I mean, in 2002, I believe the Arab League came up with what's known as the Arab Peace Initiative, which reversed the 3 no's of Khartoum that basically said to Israel, the conflict is no longer existential, but it is political. If Israel ends its occupation of Arab land, then Israel will get recognition and normalization from the Arab world. I think this is a fundamental thing, and I think the Arab world has not only kind of informally, but diplomatically and formally moved further on towards adopting a 2-state solution, which by definition includes acknowledgement of Israel. Yeah. And secondly, the Palestinians have done the same. I mean, in Oslo and post-Oslo. And there is a reason why the negotiations always go back to where they stopped, because there's a certain logic to this. This is not a bazaar. There's a logic. And there is something interesting that when the Trump plan came out, which tried to reverse this logic, the Trump plan has found no traction anywhere in the world. So I think we're not talking about bartering right now. We're not talking about the shuk. We're talking about how do you take a set of interests, genuine, concrete interests and concerns, and how do you try to balance them? And the margin for the balance is quite narrow. But ultimately, as I said earlier, I believe that for politics, this is not a conversation to be had today, and we have to look at the very doable, very concrete things that both sides, whether on security, water, economic, that both sides can actually collaborate and cooperate on to start creating a different dynamic in the near future.
Great. Well, I want to say thank you both, Ghaith and John. What a great discussion. I certainly learned quite a bit, and you know, your passion, your intellectual depth into this matter gives this American Jew hope that, you know, should people listen to the two of you and have this discussion more, you know, maybe we can find the right place for both Palestinians and Jews in the area, to Israelis specifically, to live in peace for generations to come. So, and for all of you out there, thank you all for joining us today. We invite you to continue learning with us. And if you would like to, we have a jewishvirginia.org. Visit the Community Relations Council page to explore the CRC's extensive list of resources on this topic. And we're looking forward to the Konikoff Center for Learning at the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater's conversation on Thursday, July 23rd at noon, with Avraham Infield, the President Emeritus of Hillel International, who has invested a lifetime building Jewish identity and strengthening the state of Israel by instructing Jewish youth on 5 core principles: the Hebrew language, the land of Israel, Jewish values, the Jewish religion, and the Jewish community. We look forward to joining us for another meaningful and exciting conversation in the near future. Thanks so much.